Good evening. Welcome. I'm John. I am the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Carl Phillips in support of his latest collection, Pale Colors in a Tall Field. Some Zoom security etiquette stuff just to go over really quickly. You heard me as you got connected. You're muted. You'll stay muted. And we do ask that you keep your video off through the duration of the event. The chat is closed publicly as well, but you can keep the chat window open because I'll be in there periodically to share links to where you can purchase Carl's books. And as well, you can ask any questions you might have for a Q&A in the chat as well. I'm the only one who'll see them. You'll just send your messages to me, and then I can ask your questions to Carl at the conclusion of our conversation. And speaker view is probably the ideal viewing experience tonight. That way you will just see who's speaking and not a big grid of blocks. As a reminder, you can purchase Pale Colors in a Tall Field and many other collections by Carl Phillips on our website by the page that brought you here. They should all be listed. And if you're watching later on YouTube, you can always purchase books in the description. There's links in there as well. And books are available for curbside pickup. In fact, all of Carl's books, I think, or at least most of them are available for curbside pickup at this time if you live in Southeast Michigan. And in lieu of a book purchase, we also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming as we remain closed to the public. So whether you'd like to think of it as this week's donation subscription to our programming, or maybe the month of September's subscription to our programming, or for the remainder of the year, you can make a donation at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening, or maybe this morning or this afternoon, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Carl Phillips. He teaches at Washington University in St. Louis. His recent books include Wild as the Wind, also the chapbook Star Map with Action Figures, and of course, the most recent, his 14th Pale Colors in a Tall Field, as well as the prose collection, The Art of Daring, Risk, Restlessness, Imagination. Please join me in using your Zoom clap or heart reactions to welcome Carl to your living rooms.
Hello. Thanks for having me. I guess I'm just starting. All right, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, John, for having me. And I'm going to read, I believe I was asked to read about 10 minutes, then we're going to have a conversation. So I'm going to read some poems from Pale Colors in a Tall Field. And I'm going to do something that I have not been doing with readings, is wearing my glasses. And I keep messing up because I can't see without my glasses. And my partner told me that's what the glasses are for. I'm going to put them on and read 4 poems or something, 4 or 5. This is called, see, I don't like it because it bounces off. Let's see what happens. This is called Tugging the Arrow Out. And I don't know if it's, well, it's interesting context. This is written maybe 2 days after the last election. So, tugging the arrow out. There's a nudging that a living horse will sometimes make toward a dead one. A nudging not so much against death, what is knowable to a horse but not understandable, but against the space right before loneliness settles in for real, that horses do, it seems, understand. And so that was the first day. The night was what night always is. A black starfish, black according to some for holiness, to others for the limbs themselves, unfurling as if from long sleep or a late stiffness, or as when a quiet thing and very still starts moving, moves, one stiff black limb at a time. This next poem is called Dirt Being Dirt. And I am wearing the glasses. Dirt being dirt. The orchard was on fire. But that didn't stop him from slowly walking straight into it, shirtless. You can see where the flames have foliaged, here especially his chest. Splashed by the moon, it almost looks like the latest proof that while decoration is hardly ever necessary, it's rarely meaningless. The tuxedo's corsage, fog when lit scatteredly, swift from behind, swing of a torch, the lone match struck, then wind shut. How far is instinct from a thing like belief? Not far, apparently. At what point is believing so close to knowing that any difference between the two isn't worth the fuss, finally? A tamer of wolves tames no foxes, he used to say, as if avoiding the question, but never meaning to. You broke it. Now wear it broken. I feel I should be saying something about these poems, but I don't usually know what I should say. Except that strangely, several of them are a little more narrative than I'm used to writing. And there seems to be a mysterious we group that is traveling across the book in occasional poems. I'm not quite sure who they are, but this is one of those poems that has that we. It's called, "Is It True All Legends Once Were Rumors?" And it was as we'd been told it would be, some stumbling wingless, others flew beheaded. But at first, when we looked at them, we could see no difference. The way it can take a while to realize about how regretfulness is not regret. As for being frightened, though for many animals the governing instinct, when most afraid, is to attack, what about the tendency of songbirds in a storm towards silence? Is that fear too? For mostly, yes, we were silent, tired as well, though as much out of boredom as for the need to stretch a bit, why not the rest on foot, we at last decided. And dismounting, each walked with his horse close beside him. We mapped our way north by the stars, old school, until there were no stars, just the weather of childhood, where it's snowing forever. All right. Here's a poem called "If It Must Be Winter." I guess I should say that that title is actually from one of the last sentences in a Linda Gregg poem. I think the line in her poem is, "If it must be winter, let it be absolutely winter." But anyway, I borrowed from that, and the title of this poem is "If It Must Be Winter." Not crowns, not conquest defined in terms of how many fear you, or fear to say otherwise. Not by these will you know your own royalty, but in smaller ways, how to the least gesture there's more power than seems reasonable, though it will feel deserved. So I was told, and they have not proved wrong. I've but to open my hand, bees come to it, the slick fur of bees assembling as toward an honor in no way expected, though each time the honor remains mine, as if almost it should, as if certain privileges had to do with destiny. Do I believe that? Do I? My hand a sea across which the wings of the bees flash like signal flags whose patterns, instead of translating, I make up my own translations for. I shall do as I please. As a lovely argument can make a difficult truth more clear, if not more sweet. Though is there not a sweetness to clarity that can almost make the truth seem worth it? To say I'm not quite sure makes me no less king here. Sometimes I open my hand and there's no sea at all, just a windy plain, What appear to be dust storms crossing it turn out, on reaching me, to be the disappointments, all of them, that I never intended, each one on horseback, my cavalry, each face raised toward mine, as if awaiting command, hungering for it, forgetful or stupid. I can see no difference. Look away from me. I haven't said you can look at me. And I'll just read two more poems. This one is called To Be Worn Openly at the Wrist or at the Chest and Hidden. If I believed in a God, he would be a sea god, like the sea in its predictability, now approach, now recede. Beneath such a God, I would not mind, I think, being the shore. Say of the sea what you will. It's the shore that endures the routine loss without which, what strategies would there be for softening the hollowness that any victory, give it time, comes with? How curb the risk of arrogance with its doomed but not undangerous hound complacency? I made this for you. Put it on. I know it's not going to matter whether the decisions I made were the ones eventually I even meant to make, or should have thought maybe more than twice about. What's history anyway, except, according to the latest mouth saying so, just what happened. I flourished undramatically, to no apparent purpose, like pretty much everyone. The sea dragged the shore. The shore suffered the sea. And I'll end with this poem that the book ends with, called Defiance. Homer is mentioned, but you don't have to know anything about Homer. Isn't that nice? And yeah. Defiance. Some say the point of war is to make the need for tenderness more clear. Some say that's an effect of war, the way beauty can be. Homer's Iliad, for example, or many centuries later, how the horse's head to protect it in combat would be fitted with a chafron, a strip of steel, sometimes mixed with copper, all of it hammer-worked, parts detailed in gold. I love you as I've always loved you, one man says, meaning it to another. That doesn't make love true. This only needs to be troubling if we want it to be. Our minds are, as the days are, dark or bright, says Homer, the words like coral bells in a pot made to look like the head of an ancient god, a sea god, moss for seaweed across the old god's face. To believe in ritual in the name of hope, there lies disaster. And turned to him and took his hand, the scarred one. I could feel the scars, little crowns, mass coronation. For by then, all the lilies on the pond had opened. Thank you. It scared me when you disappeared there, John.
Sorry.
What's happening? Am I supposed to start?
No, I should have prompted you to begin.
Quite all right.
People are clapping, and so claps in the darkness, and we appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. It's nice.
It's really lovely to hear you read. And I was reminded of hearing you read when I was in the MFA program at the University of Michigan. And you visited, I think shortly after, way back in 2010, I took American poetry since 1950 with you as an undergraduate, and then saw you a couple years later at WashU. And I remember my friend, the poet Russ Brakefield, and I sitting sort of close in the front, and both probably having too many drinks on an empty stomach, being very uh, emotionally overcome by your poems. And just because we have so much, I don't know, you were a poet that we talked about a lot, so it was sort of this like, very peak, I guess, writing program experience to see you come read. And so in addition to that, I mean, it's a pleasure to have you virtually at the bookstore, simply because I've admired your work over the years, and look forward to each new collection and forcing it on people. And as well, the opportunity to talk to you for this event meant I got to spend a lot of time with this new collection in a way that I don't think I really have spent time with poetry collection in quite a while, which feels kind of weird, but certainly great. And so I was thinking about, this is your 14th collection, and I think authors are often asked to speak very pragmatically and in terms of sort of writing craft and process about how a book comes together. And I think you've said in interviews and talks that you often write in fragments in a notebook while sort of like normal day-to-day life is happening, and then you'll sit down and try to pull those poems together, and then you'll end up with 50 or so poems, and then you'll sort of winnow them down to the collection, and then there's some sort of thematic energy that comes from that process that's not sort of pre-thought out. But I've also thinking about your poems as a reader, and not so much as someone who also went to an MFA program or writes poetry or whatever, but just as a reader, as collections that have like marked time for me. So like I can like albums, like I can remember like where I was, like when I read Double Shadow, like reading it in the subway in New York, buying it at the Strand or whatever. And the way the poems reflect what's happening or where I'm situated, or speak to me in whatever predicament I'm in, or state of life I'm in. And that's the sort of cumulative effect of the work and looking forward to the work. And so I wonder what it's like for you as a poet to look back on those previous collections post the process of composing them and submitting them, like your body of work. Are they memories, or are they building blocks for future collections, points within sort of like an ongoing inquiry for you? I'm just curious how they factor into that process as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the way I like to think of it sometimes is how when one gets to at least my age, and you have many decades you can look back on, and in the way that you might look back on your 20s, let's say you're 60. And so in that sense, I guess they are markers of time for me too, because I don't sit around reading, my old books. Or if I did, I wouldn't be caught doing it. But for example, like if I look at poems from my first book, I have all the feelings that I have when I look at a photograph of myself from that time period. I think, oh, wow, look at all the stuff you didn't know yet. Look at how, or I'll look at a picture and think, you weren't bad looking, Carl. You thought you were so ugly when you were like 25, but it's okay. Plus, I have the hindsight now to be able to say, I know how the future turned out. So sometimes it's hard going back to another book, because I'll see that it came out of something that was very hard. My first two books especially are that way. And so it's hard to go back and think, oh yeah, I remember when I was like thinking I was like writing to save my life. And, and in some ways I think that was true. And so So it's odd, but yeah, I also have associations with place too. Or at this point, there'll be books where I think, oh, that's when I was in such and such relationship, and now I'm not in that relationship. So
Mhm.
it's like you look back, and it's bittersweet. There's stuff that you like revisiting. There's other moments where you think, huh, I forgot how scared I was. So, but I'm kind of glad to have a record of all that. So I don't know. Maybe that's what one does in retirement. Reads all of one's old oeuvre.
And see what happens from that. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I just and you've talked about too about how you there are similar themes, and sometimes you're maybe concerned about saying the same thing again.
Mhm.
Um, but I just always get the sense that there's some of the same building blocks or some of the same ideas being explored, but um, I don't know. I often think of the thrust of your work as, these things are, and you've written about it too. I mean, you write in the Art of Daring that um, the inquiry is an ongoing one across history because the problem being investigated resists solution, and yet we as humans can't resist trying to find solutions.
Why do I sound like that when? Why does that? I don't even sound like that when I'm actually talking. It's so strange. Hmm.
It's I don't know. It's an effective voice, certainly.
Apparently, but the thing is, I think it's yeah, it is. I think we only have a handful of subjects anyway, and
Yeah.
or obsessions, and I guess I feel like you're right. I did used to worry about it, and then I thought writing about something like the body.
Hmm.
Um, well, to have written, that's a very good example of writing about that in your 20s, and to
Hmm.
think, oh, I'm all set. I've done all my body poems. And I think, really, well, what's your body like at 40? What's it like at 60 or beyond? And so um, I like pushing at how things change. I actually think it was Shakespeare and Dickinson who made me feel like it was okay to be that kind of poet, because to me, like Shakespeare's sonnets, I think, okay, they're basically all about love. But they go through so many ramifications of what love can be, and it deepens and changes. And the same with Dickinson's, say, thinking about mortality. But she's not always looking at it the same way. It's like these things are like elusive subjects, so you catch one side of them only to learn that there are like 58 other sides that you
Right.
missed seeing. So it's an incentive to keep writing too, because you haven't exhausted your subject.
Right, and that project's not done as you write,
Right.
and I think maybe you're also maybe also as anyone as a writer or a creative is working against this feeling like you've exhausted the capacity to say more or something like that, and um, that kind of linear approach to things of just how there's always more sides to things can seem elusive, even though it's like you're alive, you're still going through life and
Sure.
having experiences, and they
But even something like a memoir, like if somebody writes, say, a memoir about, I don't know, let's say they were held prisoner and sexually assaulted. And you could say, well, they write that story, and now what book can they write again? They can't write that same story. But forever they're living in the wake of that experience. And that experience is shaping them differently as they progress across time. So even that, this is why, like, when my students will sometimes say, do I have to suffer like routinely? I mean, first of all, I always say, well, you will suffer routinely because that's what life is sometimes. But I think they think like they have to keep finding a traumatic thing or make
Mm.
something traumatic happen. But you don't have to. You just have to live attentively with what has happened. And yeah, that seems enough. Anyway, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. Well, I mean, so one of the things I was thinking about when I was reading the collection again was that on these sort of themes and revisiting them was the poem "Wherefore Less Lonely," just sort of near like the center of the book,
Hmm.
and is also, I guess, to me, sort of like the central poem of the book in many ways,
Yeah.
and kind of expresses the central tensions of the collection. the passage I'm thinking of is Augustine speaks of memory as a mansion of vast halls, many chambered, and fair enough, that's how memory can seem, though other times a labyrinth of dead ends and false openings. There's a way out, but finding it. And so the collection explores memory, and memory also has many sort of siblings or fellow travelers, um, regret and shame and desire, and all of them sort of occupy this space um, of where a sort of internal and maybe irresolute moral conflict is occurring as well, or an exploration of that. I want to keep myself from going on to the side, but I'm always also struck by how, for you, questions of in your writing, questions of morality or exploring questions of morality are happening internally. And we think of them so much as like related to behavior and action, but often it's sort of a reflective process. Anyways, I see that happening as well, and but all these themes are sort of figured in your poems, I think, through at least the past 5 or 6 collections. But there is a way to me that it's more restless here. And I was listening to a conversation you had with Francine Harris, and she mentioned that like fear is a word that appears throughout the book as well. And I'm coming to the end of a question, realizing I haven't really asked much of a question.
I'm listening. I'm holding on.
But I think the other thing I was thinking of was how the last poem, which you did read, the last poem in the collection, I think I'm trying to remember way back when I took your class as an undergrad, that I think we talked about poetic closure, and a sense that you have that the poems, the best poems sort of resist closure in a way. They're not sort of charting this sort of circle and saying, okay, we've kind of closed off this loop of something. I think of your poems as often sort of gesturing at some sort of mystery, and giving some sort of instruction towards it. And but there's a way, there's like this way that the last poem, especially that really startling line, which those of you who are viewing certainly heard, the for by then all the lilies on the pond had opened, which is really resisting closure, but also there's like this kind of finality to it. And I'm also thinking about how you've mentioned that your next collection, the title poem will likely be this poem that you published in Poetry, the most recent issue, called Then the War. And I suppose my question is, because I'm rambling, is just in the same way that you're mentioning that these there's different sides to these themes that you're exploring, so there's always an endless there's something new to reflect upon, even if, say, you have some distance of whatever the originating idea or event was. Is there something that happens in a different way as well, where something about the process of the poem, not quite catharsis, but something about the process of writing the poem informs something about those events and allows you to, I don't know, reach some sort of conclusions, not closure, not saying these things can be solved, but there's I see the shift between the last poem of Pale Colors and Then the War, which is really speaking, I think, also to like the world right now, as well. Like, very, not that your poems never have done that. I think that they're always doing that, but there's like a reference of like sturdiness in that poem, and it seems to be leaving behind the concerns of some of the things that are sticky about memory. Some of the things that are troubling about memory are explored, to me, in this collection in a more restless way. And then towards the end, it's like, okay, I can't solve those things, this new territory. And I wonder if that's what it's like for you as a poet, as I've explored this new side of this thing. I want to, resisting sort of sense to sort of tie it off or close it. But now that that collection of poems is done and I feel like I've explored what I've explored, something else is happening. And that's how, I don't know, the next collection is formed.
Well, it'd be too easy to say I don't know. Um,
Well, it's
but,
not, I'm sorry, it's not really a question, but it's,
well, I can talk about how, first of all, I guess I think of restlessness as a writing. I think it's generative.
yeah.
I find restlessness of imagination to be generative because that's what makes us not just write something, but we keep teasing it and investigating it beyond like the superficial level.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know. In terms of, you're right. I don't. I do resist closure of a certain kind of predictable type, and because I guess I think that the only really believable closure to me is something like death. That's closure, I suppose. Although even that, I would say, at least for the people who live beyond, the death of friends, for example, resonates even after those friends are gone. But I so no. First of all, I don't have it. I like when I ended. I finished this book, Pale Colors. I decided to have that poem be at the end, Defiance, because I was aware that it behaves differently from any of my other poems. When I put it together, I thought this doesn't seem like it can work because it goes so far, and then it's almost like it abandons everything it worked for, and there's this almost like a separate poem, and it comes out of nowhere. Like, who are these people? Who's taking whose hand, and where are these lilies and everything? But for some reason, I thought the link to me was that I had said it was wrong to put your faith in ritual. And then I show a ritual of two people taking each other by the hand, and also the ritual of spring when the lilies open. And so I thought, I don't know, there were ways in which I could argue that it was still, not insanity and that it made some sense. And then I didn't have any thought about, I never have a thought about what's happening next. I just thought, whatever. And in fact, this new manuscript, I had the poems, but I had started putting it together and I thought it was done in January or in December of last year. And then when I was in Massachusetts driving up to Boston, most of the lines of the poem, Then the War, came to me. I was on the highway writing before I remembered that, oh, you have a phone. You can actually dictate into your phone. So I was, stops leaving my lane in traffic. But then I went back and forth, and it was only last month that I thought, oh, that's the title poem. And I don't know why. I agree, though. It seems like it comes right out of, it's right before COVID becomes something we're aware of. But there was already this sense, it seems to me, of a military state, in a way.
Yeah.
And these people trying to make a life of intimacy.
Yeah.
Within the context of fascism. And that was easy to imagine because of how we've been living the last few years, it seems to me. But so yeah, I guess that's, but I don't know if I can say, I guess I used to love hard closure. I was very addicted to Louise Glick's poems. And it seemed to me, at least in her earlier poems, that she would sort of lay down this huge gauntlet at the end of each poem. And I thought, I want to do that too. I want to do that and defy anyone to contradict me. But, and that's a perfectly valid way of going about, but it wasn't true to what I'm writing about, I guess, and how I live. And so I think the problem is, as in my actual life, I find, because I also think that sexual restlessness is important because it's what keeps curiosity alive and it's what can make a relationship not become stagnant. But the challenge is, how do you do that if you, say, want to commit to monogamy? How do you calibrate restlessness with stability? And something that I thought would be easy, I thought, well, you just get older and then you kind of actually just lose all desire and apparently just, read books all the time. But as it turns out, it seems to me that's not the case.
Yeah.
Sometimes things are even more intense the older one gets. And so in the same way with poems, I want to, of course, reach some kind of conclusion. What's the point, if not to have come to the end of a meditation? But at the same time, I don't want it to seem as if this is the end. I don't know. It's hard.
No, that makes sense. And I think too, maybe my reading of this collection too is colored by, the conditions under which you're writing in the war, and this way that it feels like things are, if not like just unveiled to be as horrific as they've sort of secretly always been, then at least accelerating.
Mm-hmm.
That revisiting this collection ahead of talking to you, is thinking about how I had this in the sort of upheaval of all this stuff. There are moments like early on during, like, say, quarantine, where I would think about something that some sort of memory that you have that causes you sort of embarrassment or secondary embarrassment, or it's just unresolved and kind of sticky.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of thought, like, oh, I don't really care about that anymore. So much has happened.
Mm-hmm.
So much has been, all that stuff has sort of been tossed aside. And so revisiting this book and seeing sort of like in defiance, um, telling someone you love them, that doesn't make love true, but this only needs to be troubling if we want it to be, seemed
Mm-hmm.
like a kind of closure of, like, yes, there's that irresoluteness, and I leave it there. So that's why it was interesting to see the shift that's sort of happening, and then the war was sort of like this sturdiness within a darkening state of affairs, I suppose.
Yeah, I think sometimes, because when I, as I often have, when I despair that I don't write about things that are relevant to the contemporary scene, um, I, not that I despair too much about that, because we can only write what we write. But I I realize that maybe all along I've been arguing for um, how important intimacy and privacy are, but all the more so in a society that when various moral guideposts and also just laws and things like that, when these things become very slippery and fall away, all you have is what you yourself believe in, and
Yeah.
and this and maybe all you can control is the small world you make with friends, partners, whatever. um, and I also feel like in a world that seems increasingly about brainwashing and, you know, is the news even what we, is it real, and fake news, and even respected papers
Mhm.
being afraid sometimes to actually speak the truth about something and try to soften it. I feel as if, um, I don't know, language is even more sacred and
Mhm.
more of, I guess, what Michael Palmer told me one time: language is a sacrament, and I feel as if it seems as important to hold on to as the intimacies we construct out of language, as a way of bolstering, I guess, against the onslaught of all kinds of chaos, but including the whatever is meant by meaning. And I know that there's, truth and meaning and all that. There's no one definition of it, but yeah, um, it seems important, and more important these days.
Yeah. No, and but I don't know. I think that's why returning to your poems now, but I mean, it's always pleasurable, but now especially is for those reminders. Simply because there's also these uncertainties in the poems as well, and there's this like a comfort with them always in your work. Recognizing the irresoluteness, but being comfortable with it as well. And also, yeah, that those the so much in your work is also about the tenderness of intimacy and grace and gesture and things like that. And they appear, yeah, like a sacrament. Yeah, Michael Palmer was one of the poets that I think I was introduced to in your class,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
who um, looms large for me as well, simply because of how he uh, does similar things with language and elusiveness.
Yeah. no, I very much admire him and his work.
Um,
Yeah.
I think I want to add too that some folks have already asked questions, but please, if you have questions, you can submit them in the chat. And I'll just ask you one more question, and then I'll turn it over to our guests.
Okay.
I the another poem in here that I love, even if sleep and death are brothers. I was at the end. I saw in the notes that sort of the final sentences in that poem are from funerary inscriptions.
Mm-hmm.
And then I remembered that there's like a translation, I think, of a funerary inscription as well in from the devotions.
Yes.
Um, and um, and then I was like reading about, I don't know, some JSTOR article that I couldn't get full access to because I'm not a student anymore. But about ancient funerary inscriptions from antiquity and how they're really weird. Some of them are pretty strange. Like a teenager, it's like a dialogue because they'd be by the street and you'd be walking by them,
Yeah.
and there was one that the author called sort of boring, where it was like a 13-year-old who hadn't amounted to much, sort of admitting as much or something. It was striking to me. But
Speaking of intimacy,
yeah,
intimacy between the dead and the living.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the frankness and the directness of the inscriptions, and it's in the poem as well. What is the last line? Will my son survive?
Yes.
Yeah, just yeah, like very not varnished for, like a today's cemeteries. But I mean, if viewers don't know, you were a Latin instructor for a long time before you became a professor at WashU,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly the antiquity and classical literature figures in your work. And I'm just curious about how it informed your early work, especially, but how it still factors in. And of course, the final poem, which we've been discussing, discusses Homer as well. So
Yeah. Well, I sometimes think that it's studying classics that got me started doing this whole poetry thing, because when I was an undergraduate, I took a course in Greek tragedy, and I'd never read a Greek tragedy before. And I figured out pretty quickly that those tragedies all have in common that um, somebody's personal agenda is in direct conflict with social law.
mm.
And so, like, this is the problem with Antigone, is that she wants to bury her brother because that's her duty as a sister. But the state has banned the burial of traitors, and he died betraying the state.
Mm.
So there's no winning here. She can either be damned for failing to do her family duty, or she can be imprisoned for disobeying the law. And it seemed to me, and I didn't understand this at the time because I wasn't out and I didn't understand that I was even queer, but certainly in terms of race, I already had learned that there's a way in which people think I'm supposed to behave, um, or sound or write, and then there's how I actually do. And so I feel like I've lived my whole life not fitting in, being marginalized in this way. And when I came out and started writing the poems that kind of enabled me to come out, I think, I realized that it was because of thinking, I actually believe there was something kind of, frankly, just messed up about me, that I had been sort of trained to think that it was wrong as a man to be sexually attracted to a man. And so I thought, okay, but that is how I feel. And at the same time, I know that I'm supposed to be married to a woman and have, I don't know, 2.5 children, whatever the amount is. And so this pressure is something I think I first recognized, not in my own life, but in these Greek tragedies. And then there are so many things that happen in mythology and everything. I think in my first book, there's a poem revisiting the Leda and the Swan myth, because we're always, told that it's so beautiful, and, but then I think it took me a while to realize that's a story of rape. And she's raped by a god in the form of a swan. And it doesn't matter how many beautiful statues there are of this. It's kind of horrifying. And and so, and I think all my poems come out of this crossroads of
Mhm.
this moral crossroads. And you know, whether it, or like what I was talking about before, say you fidelity in a relationship, and so you want fidelity. On the other hand, is it human to be um, faithful to one person forever? So how do you square those things? And I don't think there is any squaring it. So that's, I feel like I kind of just live at that crossroads. See, I came up with a long answer in response.
Thank you.
I too can do this.
Well, I'm pleased to be able to not totally lose the plot. And it's just very, uh, your work is so important to me. So it's also intimidating to try to come up with questions to
Oh, but
ask
see, if
this sort
anyone
of
should
poet.
know, since you were a student in my class, if anyone should know, you know, I'm barely holding it together.
That's not
So
true.
that's how I feel when I go to class. And I usually drive home at the end of class, slightly crying, thinking,
Oh,
you know, it's a crying with sort of joy that, okay, I think I fooled them, but on the other hand, but you didn't fool yourself. And it's a
I re-
mess.
I recall everyone in that class also being intimidated by you, but in the best way possible. So,
You know, I'm glad that there's life after my class. Here is proof of it.
yeah, I think I almost failed. I think I missed a paper deadline or something truly childish, and
Hmm.
that's one of my memories too. Was just being so overwhelmed with uh,
Hmm.
that disappointment. But you were very uh, kind and gracious about it. And then I wrote a poem out of that
I'm glad.
experience.
I'm glad. Yes, I don't recall that, but I'm glad that I was kind and gracious. Always better
um,
than, I always tell my students, at the very least, just be nice to everyone, be kind. You know, I'm like, who wants to be thought of as an asshole? And, you know, I don't know. Some people seem to be proud of being thought of that way, but I don't know.
yeah,
What else do we
no,
have? We die, and then with luck, people just say he was pretty nice. I mean, that seems fine. It's not a bad thing to have behind.
well, I mean, the other thing I took away from that class too is, I think the only time you got really like upset, not like in a really like anger way, but was someone was really sort of dismissive of Jeff Clark's collection that
I
we read.
remember this, and I
Oh,
remember
really?
the student. Yes, well, because I didn't think. I don't think that you take classes in order to approve of what the reading list is. You take the class because you're supposed to be learning.
Yeah.
So, you know, and also, I too don't like every single book that I read, but I guess I figure you're not there to judge that. You're supposed to,
No.
you know, if anything, you learn about something about yourself based on why you don't like something. Um, but yeah, when you mention that scenario, the whole thing comes back to me. Yes, I was pretty much in a rage.
Yeah, it was intense, but I mean, I agreed with you. So I was, because I
Yeah,
loved that collection. So I guess I was just,
I
um,
remember her.
uh,
Now, after this whole thing, I'm going to go to my old rosters. I'm going to find out what her name was and see what she's doing now. Oh,
um,
not that I'm
well,
petty or anything. Shall we turn to
yes,
the
yes.
audience? See what
There's a
they say.
question. Well, there's a question that sort of dovetails with this, which is, I'd like to know what the act of teaching has taught Carl about the craft of writing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like well, first of all, what it's most taught me is because I teach poetry, I feel like I really have to know inside and out what I'm teaching. So in reading the text closely, I usually discover things that I didn't notice before. And then I find that they come up in my own work, or what's actually more fun is no matter how many times that I teach something, there'll be a student who comes up with a whole idea I've never had about a particular poem or about a book.
Mm.
And And I love that. I love when someone sort of, because I always think, how can I have read this poem for 20 years and missed that? But um, so it opens me up. And also, and I don't know if that's about craft so much. I guess specifically about craft, it's that in teaching anything, I feel I have to really know it. And so I think I've learned much more about craft because of having to teach craft. For example, a student will ask, well, what's a line break? And even though I think that's a pretty obvious question, then once you get into why are line breaks different from poem to poem, different authors, it's made me really then, I'll go back to my own poems and think, why do I break lines the way I do? So in that sense, it's great. I think the best teaching is at least 50% learning. Um, I learn a lot each time from my students. And it could be everything, anything. They'll come in with earbuds in, and I'll ask them what they're listening to. And it's some group I've never heard of, and I go to Apple and listen to it, and I think, wow, either I hate it or I think, that's pretty cool, actually. Usually it's pretty cool.
Well, I read in an interview too that you write during teaching and not during breaks, and that you sometimes feel like a bit of like competition. If they're working, I should be working as well. So it seems like it informs the drive in some sense.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to me if I'm going to expect people to have fluency, that it's a little fraudulent if I myself am not writing at all. So there's some kind of thing. It's not. I don't know if I think of it as competing, but showing that I too am in this with them.
Yeah.
And yeah. So so the secret thing is that when I get these leaves of absence, which I seem to be on a lot, the school thinks I'm just busy writing poems and books and everything, but not usually. But I'm thinking, so you never know what's going to come up.
Well, there is a question related to that. Can you
Yeah.
talk about the prose book you're working
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know anyone knew about that. Yes. I'm writing this book. It doesn't have a title, but I'm supposed to turn it in next summer. It's a prose book for Yale University Press. And what happened was there was this tribute at AWP conference a couple of years to me, and former students talked about me and whatever. It was nice. It was embarrassing, but nice. Anyway, and some people from the press were there. And later they said, it's clear that you have all these years of students who admire you and have learned from you. And what would you tell them if you could tell them things that they need to know about being in the writing life? And not a craft book, but
on?
a version in a way of the way I ended up describing it is it's like a mashup of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet and the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Because, you get these, it's going to be, let's put it this way, I've written 2 chapters. One is called Ambition. The other one's called Stamina. So it's going to be about things like that. What to do with silence, generative silence, but what to do with the kind of silence like writer's block. Or another kind of book that comes to mind for me is Richard Hugo's Triggering Town
Yeah.
book. So it's supposed to be like that. And this all sounded good. I was flattered they wanted me to do it. But I've never signed a contract for a prose book that wasn't already written.
Mm.
I mean, my other books, I already had these essays. I just had to put them together. So now I feel like, I've got to have a strategy, and there's an actual date to turn in a manuscript. And I'm not good at doing what people ask me to do. Like as soon as there's a deadline, I seem to not be able to do it. And so I don't know. I actually tried to tell them not to give me any money because they're wisely not giving me all the money. They gave me like a third. They say a third when you sign the contract, and then you get a little more after you show you've written something. But I wanted to say, don't give me any money because I might just run away from and take the money and that's it. But anyway,
Is that part of their
what?
is that part of the Why I Write series that Patti Smith
I don't
and
know. Is that a series they have?
yeah, there's a Patti Smith book, Devotion was part of that.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
and
maybe.
there's a few others. Yeah.
Maybe. all I know is it's going to be small, and I want it to be a small portable thing. And part of me feels like I don't have anything to say about any of this. But then just the other day, a student was talking to me about what my thoughts were about what is a writing practice? What does it look like? And what might she do to sort of shape one? And I thought, obviously, even though I feel like I know the answers to these questions, not everyone else does. So that's the idea. Not a novel or anything. No memoir.
Well, I think there will be a market for it. I don't think you have to fear that.
No, I mean, I think it will be fine. It's kind of like a little teaching legacy thing, I think of it as. So.
There's a question. Thinking of this concept of intimacy as an almost refuge from the harshness of the external world, I'm reminded of maybe a similar function of nature in Wild is the Wind, your collection before Pale Colors and Tall Field. Are there other ways where this theme of refuge or stability has maybe evolved in form over the years, or more generally patterns you've noticed in looking back on your work where certain themes or emotions have evolved in their imagery?
Oh, in the imagery. I don't know. This means I have to have paid attention to what I'm writing. And I don't always. I guess what I can say is I feel like, certain images are just always going to be there. The sea, for example. But I found myself, if anything, I'm not sure this answers the question, but I'll try. I found myself getting rid of certain images once I realized it took me a while to realize, for example, how many deer I used to have in poems. So, which is why there's a poem in Pale Colors where the deer is abandoned as dead and no longer, it's like I throw away all my symbols, my arrows, my deer, things like that. Maybe a falcon too. But then I realized there are other things that have stayed, and especially raptor birds, eagles and hawks. And I
There's a
guess
question here about horses. Sorry to interrupt. But there is a
yeah.
question about horses as well, about
Well,
what they
I mean,
figure, how they figure.
I guess I think those are the more, I find it problematic because I feel like I know I return to these images and I don't know how differently I return to them sometimes, except that I guess I think if I'm using the same image, but I'm using it as a person who's 10 years older than when I first used it, then I like to think it's being handled differently somehow. But I don't know. That's one of those moments when I do worry, especially when putting a book together. That's when you learn. I'll have all the poems and I suddenly think, what the hell? There's like a sycamore tree in 8 of these poems. And how many sycamore trees can there be in a book? So yeah. Should I say something about deer or should I wait for the question about deer?
Oh, the question was about horses. The question was,
what?
let me see if I can find it. They appear so frequently in your poems in many different places. What your relationship with horses is?
Oh, well, contrary to what some people think, I do not ride horses. I mean, I have, but I have a respect that very quickly slides into fear of horses. And the problem with it is that I've been in a couple scenes where horses behaved exactly as I thought they would, though everyone told me I was being paranoid. So one is a friend who he wanted me to go see his new mare. This is the poet David Baker, actually. He led me to his farm, his stables, to see this new horse, and the horse ended up biting a huge gouge of flesh out of his back. And I thought, okay, before we went there, I said, I'm afraid to be near horses. I'm afraid they bite. And everyone laughed at me. Ha ha, horses don't do that. And then that's what happened. Then someone else who clearly didn't know me very well, though I had been involved with him for 18 years, he gave me as a birthday present a riding lesson on a trail ride. You should have known that just because I write about horses doesn't mean I want to sit on top of them. So I go, and once I get past the fact that everyone else on the trail ride was a teenage girl, and the leader, who was also a teenage girl, said to me, "Don't worry, we have lots of old people who come and do this." But I thought, okay, fine. And then she's leading us, and suddenly her horse reared up, and her head almost got like caught in a limb or something. And I thought, my God, I just want to get back to this stable. And so I'm fascinated with horses because I love how, despite their being domesticated, they still have so much power, and they remind us very quickly that they're animals. And I love that because I also think humans are that way. There's this animal side that we suppress, but it comes out, in various ways, and what to do about that. And I think that domestication is a weird kind of thing, because I think we get complacent about animals because of it, and then we forget that they can bite, rear up, throw us, whatever. So it's complicated. I also do not go falconing, because I've been asked that before. Like, where do you go falconing? In St. Louis. I don't do that. I'd be afraid to have a falcon on my arm.
Yeah, it sounds intense. I don't think I could do that either.
Yeah, but see, thanks to the beauties of poetry, we can live it that way.
Well, there is also a wonderful poem in here, Barbarian, where you resist the image as a kind of a symbol until you mention that you're resisting the image as a symbol, and then the image comes in. So people are interested in seeing a sort of a poetic expression of this work with images that I think is really wonderful. It's in the collection, which you can buy from Literati Bookstore. I think we're at the top of the hour, so I think I should let you go. And
thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. I just put a link in the chat again for where you can buy books. It's the same place that brought you into the meeting to begin with. Carl, it's great to get a chance to talk to you. And thanks again for your work. And I'm so appreciative for the opportunity to say thank you for being a wonderful teacher, and also very inspirational poet as well, to me and to many others.
Don't make me cry. Also, good luck with your own poems. I know that the poems are out in the world and you're writing, and that's very exciting. I'm glad.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, everybody, once again, you can buy books on our website, and please continue to stay safe and take care. And we'll see you in the store as soon as we can open safely to the public. But until then, we'll see you at the next event. Thanks again, Carl Phillips. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.